Good morning, everyone. Does this work? Good morning, everyone. Can I just check you can hear me from the back? Could you wave if you can hear me? Okay, thanks. I don't want to stand here talking to myself. I've got three very quick announcements before we start the plenary. Firstly, don't forget to look at the handouts in your bag about new sessions that have been put on. You have DIY Picasso today. You can go and learn to draw like Picasso. And you've got 3 workshops in the Hilton. We have Scott Thornbury, 7 things beginning with M. The mind completely boggles. Philip Prowse and Jeremy Harmer. I'd like to quickly mention the wider membership individual scheme. This is a scheme we started up quite recently to enable teachers from less developed countries to become individual members of IATEFL. There are buckets on the reception desk. If everybody dropped in a little coin, we would get a fantastic number of new members. So far, we have 31 members from various countries in Africa for 2-year memberships each. Please each drop a coin in. Now, the third announcement is the winners of yesterday's quiz. And there are 3 winners this time, so there are 3 free registrations at the conference next year. The winners are Fleming Willardson. I think he was happy. Choi Veen. Wow. That's good, 2 happy people. And Petter Eidberg. You're going to give it to your students, right? That's fine. Please let them know at the desk. Right, we're now going to be streamed live to Cardiff online. Have I got a signal from the cameras? Yes. We're now on live. We're now probably being watched by several thousand people around the world. So let me just say to everybody who's watching us from our remote participants, welcome to sunny Cardiff. Here we are in the City Hall in this absolutely magnificent venue. And just so you can get some sort of feeling of the atmosphere, the camera is going to pan quickly around the audience. Will you please wave at the camera so you wave to all your friends back home? So I hope your mums and dads and children have all been able to see you, wherever they are. It's now, I can only say I am very privileged to introduce Bonny Norton. I have been a huge admirer of her work for many years, and in fact it's influenced my own research probably more than she realizes. I was absolutely delighted when she said that she would come and give a plenary talk at this conference. She has over 100 publications. If I started reading them out to you, you'd be here till tomorrow. Her key book, probably the one you know her best by, is Identity and Language Learning. It's influenced so many studies, a number of doctoral studies. It's really been a seminal work. When I spoke to her last night, she told me that her grandmother was Welsh, which I was thrilled about, so I asked her if... You are. I asked her if she's a quarter Welsh, and she said she didn't know. So I thought this was really interesting. As someone who's spent their life's work studying the area of identity, I hope by the end of her life's work, she manages to discover who she is. Thank you very much, Bonny. We're just thrilled to have you here.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is indeed a pleasure to be here and to thank you, Marion Williams, very much for that kind introduction, and also to Sarah Hannon for her generosity in making me feel so welcome here. I was actually feeling okay, one always feels a little bit anxious at the beginning of a plenary, until you mentioned thousands of people all over the world. And so, suddenly I had this image of this world out there, and not quite as intimate as this group here, so I hope you'll bear with me. Interestingly enough, my connection is not only with my grandmother to this area, but I noticed that David Crystal is the patron of IATEFL. And David was in fact my professor many years ago at Reading University. And he has the distinction of liberating me from English grammar by telling me that it was okay to split an infinitive. I said, I don't believe this. He said, if enough people split infinitives, it's okay to do it. So that was very liberating. And of course, he was a remarkable teacher. So it's good to be able to connect with him, and I look forward to our event on Friday evening. Also, normally when I come to a conference, I do like to arrive early and get a sense of the issues and the people and the debates. But as a teacher, I also had 50 term papers to mark before I left UBC. And in fact, when the taxi driver picked me up at my home, I said, we just have to do a little detour to the university and drop off my last set of papers. So I missed the first day of the conference, which I was very sorry to do. But because of Cardiff Online, I was in fact able to hear Lana Shahami's plenary. So that was really wonderful. So at midnight last night, I was busy taking notes. And so I do congratulate IATEFL and the conference for making this event available to people, not only, of course, online, but also for people after the conference. Because as we know in this world, where we, in the Western world, have so many resources, many people in other parts of the world would like to access those resources. And I do see that the power of technology is quite remarkable in terms of democratizing access to information. So I even had that opportunity last night when I was able to participate in what had in fact gone on earlier that day. Now, interestingly enough, Ilana's talk provides, in a sense, a broader context in which I'm going to be discussing my plenary, which is titled Identity, Literacy, and English Language Teaching. And if you recall, what Ilana was talking about was, in a sense, larger issues to do with language policy and their impact on assessment instruments and the linguistic landscape. But I'm going to be looking then at language, in a sense, in a much more micro context. So, in a sense, what you'll see here is the relationship between, in a sense, policy at larger levels, national and global levels, but also what is actually happening on the ground between people. What I'm also draw your attention to is that I do have a website. I have bought into the techno world. I do have a website, and I do try and keep it up to date. I do have lots of resources on that website. And I also have a number of publications in the first chapters of my books, because it is one way that people in different parts of the world can access resources, no matter where they're located. And the thing that always amazes me, you're going to find out that I do a lot of work in Africa, that even in the most remotest regions of Africa, there are internet cafes. And it's amazing how full those internet cafes are, and how people take advantage of the internet to access information in different parts of the world. So I just want to check before I proceed. Is everybody fine with the sound? It's comfortable? Is there an echo? Now, isn't that interesting? Some people say yes and some people say no. Might depend on where you're sitting. So I just want to be sure about that, because I can hear a slight echo, but that might be to do with the way the system works here. I just want to be sure that that's comfortable. You're comfortable? Okay. Then I can have a glass of water. So I'm going to begin with a challenge. And I was actually saying to my colleagues last night as we were having dinner, I love to be able to give talks at education conferences, because the thing about education and the thing about teaching is it keeps one very grounded and also very humble. Because we always have to, when we think about theory and we think about our research, we have to ask ourselves the question, what does this mean for practice? Does it speak to practice? And in fact, one of the things I did before I left UBC was my last class with one of my undergrad classes. I said, I'm giving you my IATEFL conference talk. And what was so amazing was that all the questions that I got from my students was, well, my students do this, and when I teach, this happens, and can you help explain to me how it's relevant for this context? So it does force me always to look at theory and look at its application for practice. But in my research, I also look at the implication of practice for theory. Because if theory is built in a university context, in a pristine environment that is divorced from practice, I do think that that theory will be impoverished. So the relationship between theory and practice is a very important dimension in my own work. So what my challenge is to what extent can new theories of identity inform classroom practice in English language and literacy education? And now, because I work, I'm going to draw on examples from Canada and also from Uganda, but I know that many of you work, of course, in different parts of the world, and some of you work with business English, some work with English for academic purposes, some people work with young kids, some people work with adults. But for me, the strength of a theory is, can it go beyond one particular place? And can it speak to your particular context? So my challenge to you is, as I discuss these ideas, is what implication might it have for your own context and your own teaching? So I'm going to begin then with an actual classroom with a student in Canada who was attending an English second language course. This is what happened to mine. I was hoping the course would help me the same as we learned in the 6-month ESL course, that some nights we only spent time on one man. He came from Europe. He talked about his country, what's happening and what was happening. And all the time we didn't learn at all. And tomorrow the Indian man speaks something for there. Maybe all week I didn't write anymore on my book. So for me, this is a little vignette. It's a window on a classroom. And what actually happened in that classroom is that Mai dropped out of that classroom. She found that it wasn't meeting her needs. And for me as an educator and as a scholar, I need to look at that context and better understand why that particular situation did not work for Mai, and what we can learn from it as both researchers and as teachers. So let's go back and have a look at the theory, and Spolsky is right up there, and I noticed that Lana was quoting Spolsky. The more time spent learning any aspect of a language, the more will be learned. Learning a language involves the opportunity for the skills to be practiced. The result is fluency. So this is not rocket science. We understand that people need the opportunity to learn and to speak and to read and to write. But for me, the question is, under what conditions will language learners speak, read, and write? And how are the opportunities to speak, read, and write socially structured? What opportunities are available to learners? And I'm sure that Spolsky would agree that these are important questions. And what we find that traditionally in the field of second language acquisition theory, these were not central questions in the field, although the field is shifting. But in the past, some of the central questions were, is she a good language learner? Is he motivated? How anxious is she? Is he confident? These were some of the central questions. But for me, the questions become, and this draws on my work in critical theory and post-structuralist theory, under what conditions is he a good language learner? Why is she motivated? And also, how is power implicated? So these are the guiding questions in my work. And also, when we look at notions of communicative competence, and we were all brought up on communicative competence, While we are interested in the rules of use, as Hyams would call them, for me the question also must be, who has the right to speech, as Bourdieu would say? And very crucially, who has the power to impose reception? Because it's not just a question of who can speak. It's a question of who will listen. Who is interested in what it is that you have to say? And in fact, Bourdieu would argue that the linguist takes for granted that those who speak regard those who listen as worthy to listen, and those who listen regard those who speak as worthy to speak. So in a sense, a rather idealized notion of language and a rather idealized notion of the world. But that's precisely what we cannot take for granted. We cannot take for granted that those who speak regard those who listen as worthy to listen, and that those who listen regard those who speak as worthy to speak. Let's have another look then at a context in which there was another learner, Martina, who felt that she didn't have the right to speak and that she didn't have the power to impose reception. She was a woman at that time, it was called Czechoslovakia, who had come to Canada and was working in a restaurant. And there were a lot of younger people in the restaurant, in fact the children of the owner. And Martina said, in restaurant was working a lot of children, but the children always thought that I don't know, maybe some broom or something. They always said, go and clean the living room. And I was washing the dishes and they didn't do nothing. They talked to each other and they thought I had to do everything. And I said, no, the girl is only 12 years old. She is younger than my son. I said, no, you are doing nothing. You can go and clean the tables or something. So for me, this was a very powerful image, because what you see is that when a person is dehumanized, they have no position from which to speak. If you are positioned as a broom, how can you engage in social interaction? But what is very powerful about Martina's situation is that even though she is positioned as a broom, even though she's sent out to go and clean the living room, she does not accept that position. She does not accept the identity of the broom. But for her, the challenge is, if I cannot speak from the position of the broom, from what position can I speak? And what she does in a very intuitive and very powerful way is to reframe her relationship between herself and her interlocutors as not a co-worker relationship, but rather a domestic relationship in which she places her co-workers as children and she sees herself as an adult and as a parent. And she can speak with authority from the position of the parent. So by reframing that relationship and creating a new identity for herself, she can claim the right to speak. So this has very powerful implications for our field, because it shows, first of all, that people need a strong identity position from which to speak, but it also means that because people do have multiple identities, that we need to find the appropriate identity from which they can speak. And so what Martina had done there was to create an identity for herself as the mother that enabled her to engage in interaction with her co-workers. She said, no, you are doing nothing. You can go and clean the tables or something. So what I've argued in my work is that we need to reconceptualize the notion of the individual. That very often in our field, what we have seen is we've seen the individual in binary terms. Good or bad, motivated or unmotivated, anxious, confident, introvert, extrovert, and so forth. We see these as inherent personality traits of our learners. But drawing on post-structuralist theories and theories of subjectivity, what I've argued is that people can be sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes motivated, sometimes unmotivated, sometimes introvert, sometimes extrovert. So we need to take seriously under the conditions under which these identities become salient. and in particular, the identities from which learners can speak. So the assumptions about identity, in classic SLA theory, people were seen as having unique identities. That's a motivated student. You can work with her. But those identities, I believe, are not unique. They are multiple and fragmented, as we see with Martina. We do not have a coherent core. Our identities are indeed a site of struggle as we work through our multiple relationships with the world. It is not fixed and ahistorical. It is constantly changing. And importantly, and this is important for education, these are not inherent characteristics, but rather produced. How is it that Martina got produced as a broom? What were the conditions that allowed an amazing, innovative, bright woman to be positioned as a broom within the context of her work? These are identities that are produced, but they can also be challenged and resisted. So in terms of identity, what I argue then is that the term identity is used to reference how a person understands his or her relationship to the world, how that relationship is structured across time and space, and how the person understands possibilities for the future. And the notion of the possibilities for the future is a very central idea in my work. Because when we're dealing with language learners, no matter where people might be, in Serbia, in Brazil, in Peru, in Africa, what are people's hopes for the future, and how are we as language teachers implicated in our students' hopes for the future? And how might that shift their identities across time and space? And how might that also shift their relationship to the world? And so what I argue is that every time language learners speak, they are not only exchanging information with their interlocutors, they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of who they are and how they relate to the social world. They are, in other words, engaged in identity construction and negotiation. So when Martina is talking to her co-workers, she is organizing and reorganizing a sense of who she is and what her rights are in relation to that community. And she's also redefining her identity within that context. Let's go back and have a look at mine. So we had a situation that mine was in a language class. Why was that language class not working for her? Now, this is not a teacher bashing exercise, because we do understand that every single context is a complex situation. But for Mai herself, what we see is a situation that did not work for her. So when I go back and think about that situation where we have a teacher who, with the best of intentions, is seeking to better understand her students and also where they come from, India, Peru, different parts of the world, the way I understand that is that one issue is that the teacher, it seems to me, is possibly essentializing identity. That when she sees those students, she's seeing somebody as Indian and somebody as Peruvian and somebody as Italian perhaps and somebody as Ugandan. But your ethnicity is only part of who you are. Your ethnicity is important, but it is only one aspect of your identity. And so in many ways, it seems to me the teacher might be essentializing identity along only one dimension. And what the teacher is also doing is looking at the past. Where do you come from? Tell us about your country, what was happening. And although the past is terribly important in terms of our sense of identity, we are also struggling with the present and, more importantly, with the future. For many of our learners, they're struggling to find a place within the world and to establish a future for themselves in a new world. And the third issue, for me, that was very interesting, a little reminder, how important literacy is in language as well. Remember Maya said, all week I didn't write anymore on my book. And she equated, in a sense, the ability to articulate ideas in writing as part of learning. And it is a reminder to us that, of course, when we engage in language learning and teaching, all the dimensions, reading, writing, speaking, listening, are all important to learning. And that capturing your learning through writing and other multiliterate means is an important part of the learning process. So for me, what is very interesting is that people might have said, when I dropped out of that class, people might have said, was she really motivated? Maybe she just wasn't motivated to learn. But I know, because I know Maya, and I knew her over a period of 2 years, she was a highly motivated learner. She worked all day. She'd have to go at night to her class, as many of our learners do. She had to confront the terrible Ontario winter. She had to take public transportation, because she didn't have her own car. She desperately wanted to learn. So she was not an unmotivated learner. But what I've argued is that Maya was not invested in the language practices of that classroom. And in my work, I've drawn then a distinction between the notion of motivation, which is a very important and useful notion, but it only takes us so far. And I've talked about the notion of investment as another construct that I think is very helpful, may be very helpful in the field. So let me explain to you what that is. While motivation can be seen as a primarily psychological construct, investment must be seen within a sociological framework and seeks to make a meaningful connection between a learner's desire and commitment to learn a language and their changing identity. So it's an attempt to capture the relationship between the desire to learn and a learner's changing identity. So what does that mean? Very often when we think of motivation, again, it's in a sense a characteristic, a fixed characteristic of a learner. Often a person is seen as either motivated or unmotivated. And the learners seem to have a unitary and coherent identity. Whereas when I talk about the concept of investment, it assumes a complex identity, changing across time and space, and reproduced in social interaction. So what questions then would I ask if I'm interested in investment? So if we think about notions of motivation, we would say, what is Maya's motivation to learn the language? And that's a fair question. But we need to understand that motivation is seen as a character trait. Language is seen as a system. And it's a primarily psychological construct that we're dealing with. But if I ask a different kind of question, what is Maya's investment in the language practices of that classroom? What is Maya's investment in the language practices of that classroom? We see that investment is a construction. We see that language is a social practice. And we see the notion as a primarily sociological construct. So what I would argue is that although Maya was a highly motivated language learner, she was not invested in the language practices of that classroom. A crucial distinction. She was motivated, but not invested in the language practices of that classroom. So, I have to ask myself as a teacher, if she is not invested in the language practices of that classroom, where do her investments lie? So at the time then, as I was working through and developing this theory, I was reading the work of Etienne Wenger. And what he argues is that we not only produce our identities through the practices we engage in, but we also define ourselves through the practices we do not engage in. So I began to think, well, if Maya is not engaged in these practices, then what are the practices that interest her? And I went on to read about Wenger's notion of imagination, My use of the concept of imagination refers to a process of expanding ourselves by transcending our time and space and creating new images of the world and ourselves. So I challenge myself to think, I wonder how Maya is thinking of her future, how she might be transcending time and space to think of a new identity for herself. And what might that be? I went back and I looked at the data, and I saw a crucial point here. After work today, when I was working by myself on New Street, then I met Carl, who was going to the same school with me last course. I just told him about my job and the course I'm taking. He said to me, the good thing for you is to go to school. Then in the future you would have a job to work in the office. I hope so, but sometime I'm scared to dream about that. So what I needed to understand that Maya worked in a factory, and she went in every day, and she was a seamstress in a factory. And in the corner of her factory was a glassed-in section of the factory where the people in the office worked. And the people in the office wore smart clothing and high-heel shoes and stockings. They may not even have earned more money, quite frankly. I don't exactly know what people earned. But for Maya, the dream was to work in the office. So when she goes to class at night after a long day at work, and she talks about India and about Peru and about Europe, she's wondering, how does that kind of connect with my dreams for the future, with my hopes of where I want to be in the future? So what I would argue is that in many ways, to work in the office and to be connected with other professionals was part of Maya's imagined community. That's where she hoped to be in the future. That was her imagined community. And in fact, I've argued that an imagined community assumes an imagined identity. And a learner's investment in the target language must be understood within this context. What are people's imagined identities, and to what extent do our language practices, are they consistent with students' imagined identities and imagined futures? So what I did then, these ideas I was developing in the early 90s, and Jasko Kano and I put together a special issue of the Journal of Language Identity and Education on imagined communities and educational possibilities. The introduction to that is actually also on my website. And we developed and we invited people from different parts of the world to contribute to that conversation. So what the argument that we make is that the relevance of imagined communities to language learning is that it introduces an orientation to the future to our educational discourse. It highlights hope and desire in language learners' identities. It addresses the power of individuals to shape the future of society. And it explores the role of ethnicity, gender, class, and other variables in constraining or enabling individual learners' capacity for imagining possibilities. For me, it's always intriguing to see, when I think of children's hopes for the future, why is it that children have very different hopes in different parts of the world? Why in some parts of the world do people want to be doctors, and other parts of the world people have very different expectations of their future? What constrains and enables children's capacities for imagining their identities in the future? So the challenge for educators, it seems to me, is how can we ensure that our learners are invested in classroom communities? What is our role as teachers in expanding the range of possibilities and possible identities for learners, as well as their imagined communities? How can we help students create an expanded range of identities from which to speak, read, and write? So what I wanted to share with you is some of my more recent work that I've been doing in the African context, because there we have been challenged to think about the ways in which we can expand identities for learners in parts of the world where there are in fact very limited resources. So I'm working with a research team, a wonderful research team, and we're working predominantly in the Ugandan context. Working particularly in rural areas of Uganda, in the Mbali area, the Masaka area, and we're also moving up north to a post-conflict zone in Gulu. And what we're trying to do in this work is to reduce those binaries, go beyond the binaries of local and global, indigenous, transnational, time and space, traditional, modern, theory, practice, and so forth. And the research question we asked is, how can students' use of multiliteracies and multiple modes of representation, such as drawing, photography, and dramatic performance, help language learners invest in classroom communities and construct an enhanced range of identities for themselves? And if you remember, Lana's talk yesterday talks a great deal about multiple modes of representation and the use of multiliteracies and the interest, as we see throughout the world, in multiple literacies that have not been fully acknowledged in our field. And I'm working with an amazing group of researchers, Maureen Kendrick and Margaret Earley and Sam Andema, and Shelley Jones, Harriet Mutonye, Lauren Oates, Juliet Tembe, Carrie Jane Williams, working in collaborative relationships with people in the Ugandan context. We've been working there for a good number of years, doing multiple research projects in different parts of the country. And the theory that we draw on here is related to the work, particularly associated with work of Gunter Kress and colleagues, who argues that in any communicative mode, language, whether written or spoken, is only partial to the meaning-making process. And that multimodal pedagogies conceptualize human beings as embodied subjects, which posits an integrated relation rather than a dualism between body and mind. And integral to this new agenda is understanding how cultures select from and choose to develop particular multimodal possibilities for communication.
Growing up in Uganda, the most important tool of learning is through storytelling. How the storyteller weaves together all aspects of life in such interesting ways is satisfying. At the end of each story was a session of the underlying lessons of the story. As a listener, you learn to note the key issues through the changes in the tone of voice and gestures the storyteller is using. The storytelling is an elaborate series of dramatization, singing, poetry, symbols, and images that communicate to the listener cultural lessons. These stories are usually embedded in the everyday experiences of the community and sometimes even carry the latest gossip, though done in the most humorous way. When there was an epidemic in the community, the most popular means of communication was through music and drama. The first time there was an epidemic of measles, the elders organized small drama and music lessons to educate the masses on what they should look out for and how to prevent the spread of the disease, as well as treat the infected child. Environmental images and songs were used to teach the English alphabet. We were told, for example, that letter D is shaped like the stomach of a pregnant woman. Modeling things using clay was also part of the learning process. We would make homesteads, and through that we were taught lessons on the importance of hiking. The lessons helped make concrete work being rather abstract lessons.
So what I found with our research is that we drew on Jim Cummins' notion of identity text. As students produce identity texts, whether they're drawings or dramatic performances or photographs, what he argues is that students have an investment. He draws on my notion of investment to develop the concept of an identity text. Optimal academic development within the interpersonal space of the learning community occurs only when there's both maximum cognitive engagement and maximum identity investment on the part of students. The products of students' creative work or performances carried out within this pedagogical space are termed identity texts. So just to share with you some of the drawings and photographs and performances that students did produce over a period of the period of time of our research. What we've argued is that drawings help students position themselves as readers in the world, and they enable students to imagine new identities for themselves. So that, for example, when we ask students, what does it mean to be literate? I couldn't help thinking of Mai, when she thought of this woman in the office in their high heel shoes and stockings. Because, for many of these students, then to be literate is in fact to be a professional and in fact to be reading English. And that, as we understand, is also a complex issue in this multilingual world. But these are some of the images that the children depicted about their understandings of literacy. Sitting on a chair reading a book is a very privileged position in Ugandan society. And in fact, I took this picture a couple of years ago when I saw a little girl running across the lawn and dropping, on her knees in front of her teachers. And I couldn't help thinking how in many ways she's living one life, but she's also, imagining another life too. So through drawings, children are experimenting with different imagined identities. Photography also provides a different identity position from which to engage with the world. And it's not just the fact that you're taking photographs that is important, but you have the identity photographer. And if you have the identity photographer, that's a different way in which you can relate to the world. Because in order to have a camera, you need to have resources, or you need to have somebody who knows somebody who has resources. So that gives you a position of power as you engage with the world. So this young woman even had, in this case, a video camera in her hand to show the power of technology. And that's why I get so excited when I see people engaging with technology, not only, of course, here in the Western world, but people in other parts of the world are very excited by the possibilities of technology in terms of the democratization of information and learning. And the girls would go in, and this young woman went in and took a picture of a commissioner, police commissioner. Normally she would never be seen anywhere near a police station. But because she had that camera in her hand and the identity of the photographer, she could actually go in and speak to people from a different subject position, from a different identity. And she could look at her world and draw comparative images of the future. One which is a very traditional image of young women in her society, but another of a woman who is literate and working professionally in a very different way in her world. Drama also gives students another whole position, another whole identity position from which to speak. And I know some of you have probably seen this little video. I think we have time just to share it with you. It's on on YouTube at least. But what I found so fascinating about this image here is this poem that Penina wrote about HIV/AIDS. But what I found very interesting is that she performed this poem and then she wrote about it. Generally in the Western world we write and then we perform. Although I kind of wonder with Shakespeare, I'd love to know how he constructed his poem. Did he always, I guess he did write first and then perform. But, for Penina it was a whole different dynamic. She performed this poem and then she wrote it out. So that connection between orality and literacy, is a very interesting connection. But perhaps even more importantly is that drama sometimes allows you to talk what others think you can't talk. It gives you a different identity position from which to speak. So here we have Penina. This photograph was taken in Uganda at an HIV/AIDS club meeting. And I'm going to play this poem. You'll just see very briefly here. I'll give you just a second to have a look at the wording because it takes a while to get your ear in. It's about preparing for a dance and the choices that you have.
Thank you very much. It's so sad.
You know, I do, like you, think that this is a most remarkable performance, and it is, as I say, on YouTube. But what it does demonstrate so effectively is that although, of course, we can read the written word, the performance is particularly powerful, and the ownership that this young woman takes over this discourse is incredibly compelling. To show you also at a younger level, what we also see here, what I want to show you in this video, is that the use of the body in learning. This little video was taken, it's about 2 minutes long, with 3 young women, 2 young girls who come home and teach their younger sister what they have learned at school. And what they've learned is something totally incomprehensible, but fascinating. It's a little poem. My name is Joe. I've got a dog, a wife, and a family. I work in a button factory. One day my boss said to me, "Hey Joe, are you busy?" I said, "No, turn the button on your right hand." And what we see here is the role of repetition in learning. And sometimes I know that, you know, in our modern world, you know, sometimes we think, well, repetition, you know, how communicative is repetition? But Vi Ramanathan has told us, you know, in a very convincing way, that some of these indigenous practices are incredibly important in learning, and not only important, but also very enjoyable practices that, and we can learn from these in our own classrooms. So let me share this with you. This is in rural Uganda. Okay, so what relevance does this have then for English language learning? One of my students was interviewing one of her participants and asked, how is learning English through doing a project like this different from learning English in the classroom? In class, teachers write on the blackboard and we just listen. In a research project, how do you use English? Communication. Do you learn more by studying English or by communicating in English? Communicating. Why? Because when you communicate, you think your own English. So I think what we're talking about here is a sense of ownership of the language, a sense of ownership of the meaning-making practices of your community, an investment in the language that you are learning. So what I've argued here is that when we develop identity texts with our students, when we give them different identity positions from which to operate in the world, they're exploring their multiple identities. They're investing in imagined futures. They identify images that limit capacity. They integrate body and mind. They experiment with diverse forms of language. They claim ownership of meaning. They give the audience an investment in the text. And most importantly, they're reclaiming their own time and their own space. So in conclusion, I began my talk by asking, to what extent can new theories of identity inform classroom practice in English language and literacy education? And what I'm arguing is that the construction of identity texts and different identity positions for our learners provides students with the opportunities to invest in both classroom and imagined communities by validating local knowledge in time and space and creating a range of identity positions from which to speak, read, and write. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
After that incredible talk, I don't feel as if I've got any right to speak anymore. So please join me and thank Bonny once more.
Thank you, Mary. There you are.